The moment my son saw the blood test results, his entire body froze. Then he looked at me and quickly looked away. That was the first time in 43 years. My son couldn't look me in the eyes. I still remember asking him weakly from that hospital bed, "Son, am I dying?" He swallowed hard before answering, "No, Dad." But his voice sounded terrified. That's when I realized the surgery was no longer the biggest problem in that hospital room. What I didn't know was that the blood test doctors requested before my operation had just destroyed everything my son thought he knew about our family. At 72 years old, preparing for the biggest surgery of my life, the only thing keeping me alive emotionally was my family, especially my only son, my pride, a respected doctor in America, the boy I sacrificed my entire life to raise. The moment he heard I was hospitalized, he flew home immediately without hesitation. And honestly, seeing him walk into that hospital room gave me strength I didn't even know I still had. My wife sat quietly beside me that evening pretending to stay strong, but something about her felt unsettled. Her hands wouldn't stop moving. Sometimes she adjusted her dress repeatedly. Sometimes she avoided looking directly at either of us. First, I thought she was simply terrified of losing me. We had been married for 45 years. 45 long years. And through all those years, there was only one thing we never struggled to agree on: our son. We built our entire lives around him. I still remember carrying him on my shoulders when he was little, walking him to school before military duty, standing under heavy rain waiting for him after evening classes, staying awake late at night helping him study when he wanted to become a doctor. There were years I barely slept. Years I worked through pain just to pay his tuition abroad. I sacrificed promotions, sold lands inherited from my father. Even after retirement from the army, I still accepted difficult security contracts because I wanted my son to become everything I never had the opportunity to become. And honestly, every sacrifice felt worth it, because that boy loved me deeply. Back then, I truly believed nothing on earth could ever separate me from my son. I truly believed I was building a future for my bloodline. The surgery was risky. Doctors needed blood urgently before they could proceed. Without hesitation, my son volunteered immediately. But because of my condition, the hospital insisted on running compatibility tests first. That's when I noticed something strange. My wife suddenly became uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. I remember her forcing a nervous smile before saying softly, "Can't they just proceed? You're a doctor already. They know what they're doing." But my son shook his head immediately. No shortcuts when it comes to my father. At the time, those words touched me deeply. I remember smiling proudly from that hospital bed. That was my son. Disciplined, principled, responsible. The kind of man every father dreams of raising. But only minutes later, everything changed. 1 minute, he was calmly discussing surgery procedures with the doctors. The next minute, his entire body froze while staring at the blood test results. The doctor handling the files suddenly went quiet. Too quiet. I watched him check the results repeatedly, then stare at my son strangely, then back at the files again. And suddenly, the atmosphere inside that hospital room changed completely. Even the machines around me suddenly sounded louder. The air felt heavier. My son's face slowly lost color. Real fear entered his eyes. Not confusion, not stress, fear. Then came the moment that disturbed me more than the surgery itself. My son looked at me and quickly looked away, like he couldn't bear looking at my face anymore. That terrified me deeply, because for 43 years, my son had never avoided my eyes. Never. A few seconds later, he quietly asked the doctors to repeat the tests privately. That's when fear started crawling into my chest. Not fear of death. Fear of the unknown. When he returned to my room later, his face looked pale, broken. I asked him softly, "Son, what's wrong?" But he barely answered me. Then suddenly, he asked my wife to step outside with him. I watched both of them disappear into the hallway. And for the next several minutes, I could hear low, tense voices outside my hospital room. At one point, I heard my wife crying softly, then silence. Long, uncomfortable silence. When my son finally returned, he could barely look at either of us anymore. But despite whatever he had discovered, he still stayed beside my bed the entire night, still adjusted my blanket, still checked my medication personally, still sat awake beside me while everybody else slept. That hurt me even more somehow, because deep down, I knew my son was silently carrying something painful alone. Later that night, while pretending to sleep, I watched him sitting quietly near the window staring at the repeated blood test results again and again, like he was praying the numbers would somehow change. At one point, he covered his face with both hands and completely broke down silently. That was the moment I realized, whatever those results said, had destroyed him emotionally. The next morning before surgery, I finally asked him directly, "Son, am I dying?" He swallowed hard before answering, "No, Dad," but his voice cracked badly. And at that exact moment, I realized the surgery was no longer the biggest problem in that hospital room. Something else had gone terribly wrong. The surgery eventually went successfully, but after waking up, nothing felt normal anymore. My wife avoided eye contact constantly. My son barely smiled anymore. And every time I tried speaking to both of them together, the atmosphere became painfully heavy, like everybody was hiding the same terrible secret from me. A day later, my son quietly asked his mother to accompany him outside the hospital building. She returned almost 30 minutes later with swollen eyes. That frightened me badly. But what I didn't know was that my son had secretly asked her a question capable of destroying our family forever. Who is my biological father? My wife denied everything immediately. She called the hospital incompetent, said the results were impossible, said somebody mixed up the blood samples. But according to my son, her voice kept shaking the entire time. And when he looked directly into her eyes and asked again, she suddenly started crying uncontrollably. Not angry crying, not confused crying, guilty crying. That was the moment my son realized the problem wasn't the hospital, it was our family. Still refusing to believe the truth completely, my son secretly ran another test, this time on his mother alone. And when the results confirmed she was biologically related to him, everything inside him collapsed completely, because that meant only one thing. For 43 years, his mother had carried a secret capable of destroying 2 lives. 3 days after I was discharged home, I woke up one night and found my son sitting alone outside in the dark, just staring into space. He didn't even notice me sitting beside him at first. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then finally, I asked him softly, "What happened in that hospital?" My son lowered his head immediately, and for the first time since childhood, I saw tears falling from his eyes. Real tears, painful tears. He tried speaking several times, but the words refused to come out. Then finally, in a broken voice, he said something I will never forget for the rest of my life. "Dad, the blood test showed we are not biologically related." I felt my entire body go cold instantly. First, I honestly thought the hospital made a mistake. It didn't feel real. Nothing about it made sense. 43 years. 43 years of birthdays, school fees, hospital visits, military discipline, airport goodbyes, graduation celebrations, father and son conversations, all suddenly collapsing inside one sentence. I remember laughing weakly out of confusion, then immediately looking toward the house, toward my wife's room, and suddenly, 45 years of marriage no longer felt safe inside my chest. My son quickly explained everything, how he secretly repeated the tests, how he tested himself again privately, how he even tested his mother quietly afterward. And when her results came back positive, that's when he realized his mother had carried this secret for 43 years. I looked at my son that night, and for the first time, I realized he was hurting even more than I was. Because while I was losing the truth about my son, he was losing the truth about his entire identity. Then suddenly, he grabbed my hand tightly and said something that completely broke me. "Dad, please don't think I stopped being your son because of blood." At that moment, I couldn't hold my tears anymore, because despite the pain, despite the betrayal, despite 43 years of lies, the only thing my son was worried about was losing me, and honestly, that hurt far more than the DNA results themselves.